It was critical for immigrants coming west along the California Trail to reach the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains before winter set in. The infamous Donner Party wagon train of 1846 arrived late in August at the eastern base of the Sierras because they were misled about a shortcut called Hastings Cutoff. The harsh winter snows of the high altitudes were early that year, and they were accompanied by unusually heavy and prolonged snowfall, blocking passage through the mountains down into California. The Donner Party wagon train of 81 people ran out of food, and only 48 members of the party made it into California alive. The other 33 people died in the mountains, mostly due to hunger and the harsh weather. 21 of those who died were cannibalized by the survivors. 2 Indians who came up from the California side in the first of 3 rescue parties sent from Fort Sutter were the only people who were murdered for food. Patrick Breen kept a diary of the 5-month ordeal. He came down the mountain on April 29th with the last rescue party sent from the western side. Several weeks later, on June 22nd, most of the remnants of the Donner Party campsites were torched, and the cadavered corpses were buried in a mass grave by horrified members of the famed Mormon Battalion as they traveled east towards the Salt Lake Basin. When Ina's stepfather, William Pickett, who was a printer and a lawyer, and the other men in their wagon train started their trip from Missouri, they did not have an experienced guide. They decided to rely on guidebooks to navigate the trip to California. When they reached a pleasant spot along the trail, in the evenings, the young people found the campfire an invitation to singing. As the men talked and plotted the next day's course and its challenges, Ina loved these moments away from her fears of Indian attack and the other dangers of the journey. And she frequently brought out her guitar and played the Scottish songs in her repertoire, as her beloved, ever-present dolls sat nearby. Ina read Pickett's books of Shakespeare and Byron as she learned to love the expression of words in rhyme. She practiced as she walked alongside the wagon. When they reached the foothills of the Sierras, they found a sick man near their camp, wrapped in an Indian tent made out of branches, his horse nearby. It was James Beckwith, who had just completed his trail on the eastern side, and he was stricken with an acute skin infection and fever. The women brought him water and put cold towels to his head. A day later, they brought him food. Beckwith would later say in his book that while I was busily engaged on my road, I was seized with a sickness and had abandoned all hopes of recovery. I was over 100 miles away from medical assistance, and my only shelter was a brush tent. I made my will and resigned myself to death. Life still lingered in me, however, and a train of wagons came up and encamped near where I lay. I was reduced to a very low condition, but I saw the drivers and acquainted them with the object which had brought me out there. The women, God bless them, came to my assistance, and through their kind attentions and excellent nursing, I rapidly recovered from my lingering sickness. After a few days, Beckwourth was recovered enough to accept their invitation to join them in their camp. Beckwourth held the entire group spellbound for days with his many stories. He told them about his experiences as a mountaineer fur trapper, a Crow Indian warrior chief, a dispatcher for Colonel Fremont and General Kearney, and his work with the troops in the Seminole War and the Mexican-American War, and his prospecting in California. As he talked, he smiled at the youngsters who stared at the colorful stranger with amazement. Ina thought he was the most wonderful man she had ever seen. Beckwourth reached into his beaded deerskin jacket and pulled out a small paper bag of candies and gave them to the delighted children. He told them of his just completed trail. The men voted to be his first wagon train. "We were very lucky," he said. "You saved my life, and you will be the first on my trail." Along the way, one of Ina's dogs was involved in an accident that cracked its head open. Beckwith arranged a burial along the trail, with a funeral that was attended by all of the kids. Beckwith called Ina Coolbrith Little Princess. It was 1851. Ina Coolbrith was 11 years old when her family's wagon train of 17 rusty schooners had been traveling for months in the long trek from Missouri. Jim Beckwourth rode slowly ahead of the column. He knew on the maiden trip the Pickett family secret that Mrs. Pickett was, in fact, Agnes Morton Coolbrith Smith, the widow of Don Carlos Smith and former plural wife of Joseph Smith, Jr., the founder and leader of the Mormon Church. Don Carlos died of malaria at 25 years old in 1841 and was a missionary and youngest brother of Joseph Smith, Jr., who was murdered in 1844. The Pickett family was haunted by stories of the Donner Party fiasco 5 years before. When near the pass, Jim asked Mrs. Pickett if her younger daughter would like to ride with him. She would then be the first white child to do so into California. More than 6 decades later, in 1915, at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, Ina Coolbrith was the president of the Congress of Authors and Journalists. 4,000 of the world's most well-known writers and journalists were invited to a luncheon where she was being honored as the laurel-crowned poet of California. Ina Coolbrith remembered Beckwourth and her experience.
Ours was the first of the covered wagon trains to break the trail through Beckwourth Pass into California. We were guided by the famous scout, Jim Beckwourth, who was an historical figure and, to my mind, one of the most beautiful creatures that ever lived. He was rather dark and wore his hair in 2 long braids, twisted with colored cord that gave him a picturesque appearance. He wore a leather coat and moccasins and rode his horse without a saddle. When we made that long journey toward the west over the deserts and mountains, our wagon train was driven over ground without a single mark of a wagon wheel until it was broken by ours. And when Jim Beckwourth said he would like to have my mother's little girl ride into California on his horse in front of him, I was the happiest little girl in the world.
At the pass, Beckwourth dismounted and helped the girl off the horse. An autumn wind had come up, stinging their faces, whipping their clothes. Storm clouds were gathering, darkening all the landscape except the valley lying to the west below them. The sun lighted it as if on purpose for this moment. Jim pointed to the glowing valley lying against a range of blue. "There, little girl," he said. "There is California. There is your kingdom." Ina Coolbrith never publicly divulged the secret that Joseph Smith was her uncle, nor did Jim Beckwourth.